This film represents the sole cinematic recording made on Omaha Beach during the first hours of D-Day on June 6, 1944. Sergeant Richard Taylor of the Signal Corps captured both photographs and motion picture footage. While filming that morning, he sustained a wound to his arm, yet continued recording until he could be taken off the field. In this presentation, we will view authentic D-Day imagery that reveals a level of brutality and chaos often understated in dramatized portrayals. By spring 1940, the strategic situation for Nazi Germany was bleak. Deprived of crucial supplies and under severe pressure on the Eastern Front, German forces faced a looming Allied assault in the West. Adolf Hitler, despite mounting setbacks, pinned great hopes on stopping the invasion. His intent was to strengthen defenses along the coast, mount a ferocious counterattack to repel the invaders into the sea, and thereafter redirect Germany's remaining strength against the Soviet Union. For Hitler, the outcome of the Western campaign would be decisive for the Reich's future. You may have watched numerous D-Day documentaries, yet certain questions remain striking. Why did casualty rates differ so much between beaches? Why did German counterattacks fail to halt the Allies? And why did the breakout into France take longer than planners expected? The Allies selected Normandy as the invasion zone while conducting an extensive deception campaign to divert German attention toward Pas-de-Calais. Airborne units were tasked with securing the approach and flanks, while amphibious assault formations would land with U.S. forces on the right flank and British and Commonwealth units on the left. Rather than rely on capturing an existing deep-water port immediately, planners adopted an innovative logistical approach. Prefabricated portable harbors would be transported across the channel to supply the invasion force. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery assumed overall command responsibilities for Operation Overlord in December 1943, their principal adjustment was to expand the scale of airborne and seaborne forces committed to the landings. With the assault spanning a broad front, the initial strategic objectives included taking the city of Cannes and securing the port of Cherbourg thereafter. Montgomery anticipated that after weathering initial German counterattacks, Allied pressure would force German forces back to defensive lines along the Seine within a few months. That expectation did not, however, imply the campaign would be simple or short. Units chosen for the invasion received reinforcements and special equipment. British Commonwealth and American forces were supplied with amphibious DD, tanks capable of swimming ashore, and the British received additional specialized armored vehicles engineered for breaching fortifications and aiding infantry advance. Many of these vehicles were purpose-built support platforms rather than conventional tank versus tank designs, conceived by innovators such as Major General Sir Percy Hobart. Examples include Churchill AVREs fitted with Spiga mortars that could launch heavy explosive charges to demolish bunkers and pillboxes. These vehicles could also carry tools and attachments for clearing obstacles and deploy fascines, bundles of wood used to fill trenches and enable other vehicles to cross difficult terrain. As the invasion fleet massed in Britain, complete with a fabricated army group intended to simulate a threat to Calais, German defenses along the coast were simultaneously reinforced. By 1940, the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine were heavily diminished in capability, so the primary burden of defending Fortress Europe fell to the German Army, notably Army Group B under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel argued that the best chance to stop an amphibious invasion was to prevent the Allies from securing a foothold at the shoreline itself, and he intensified construction of the Atlantic Wall beginning in 1942, strengthening it with additional pillboxes, gun emplacements, beach obstacles, and vast minefields concentrated in Normandy. The quality and composition of the German units varied. Although some 58 German divisions were present in the theater by May 1944, many were second-rate garrison formations, since the most capable troops had been depleted by the exhausting battles on the Eastern Front. The primary striking power available in the West consisted of 9 Panzer divisions and 1 Panzer Grenadier division, amounting to roughly 1,400 armor vehicles and self-propelled guns. A crucial complication, however, was that Rommel lacked unified command over those armored reserves. Senior commanders such as Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and the head of the Armored Reserve, General von Schweppenberg, favored a defense-in-depth concept with panzers held back from the beaches. Rommel, expecting Allied air dominance to hinder rapid armor maneuvering, wanted tanks positioned close to probable landing zones to counter an invasion immediately. The disagreement among German commanders produced a compromise that was tactically problematic. Of the 9 panzer divisions in the West, Rommel received 3, von Schweppenberg retained 4 in reserve, and 3 were diverted to southern France as part of Army Group G. Further hampering timely response, Hitler decreed that Panzergruppe West could be committed only with his explicit authorization, a decision-making bottleneck that would have costly consequences on D-Day. D-Day had originally been planned for June 5, 1944, but adverse weather forced Eisenhower to delay the operation by 24 hours, a risky choice because any postponement risked exposing the invasion plan. Forecasts of a brief improvement in conditions on June 4th and 5th persuaded Eisenhower to launch the invasion on June 6th. On the eve of the landings, thousands of troops received a message from Supreme Commander Eisenhower advising them that the undertaking would be difficult and that they faced a capable, battle-hardened enemy. He nevertheless expressed full confidence in their courage, discipline, and skill, insisting that nothing less than absolute victory would suffice. Among those preparing for the assault, there were mixed emotions, captured poignantly by personal notes like a letter from Major James Robert Morgan, second in command of the 12th British Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment. Writing on the reverse of Eisenhower's briefing, Morgan described his anxiety and the surreal moment before the operation, offering an intimate human snapshot amid the larger strategic drama. The first waves ashore were delivered by British and Canadian airborne forces, notably the 6th Airborne Division, which descended by glider and parachute to the east of Sword Beach with orders to seize and hold key bridges across the Canal and the Orne River. Although many airborne drops were scattered, those forces succeeded in taking their objectives and then had to withstand potential counterattacks from German armored units despite being lightly armed. American landings followed closely with the principal U.S. sector at Omaha Beach, where troops confronted intense, well-prepared German defenses. German forces on the beaches mainly consisted of infantry supported by fortifications, and their positions, pillboxes, bunkers, and hidden gun emplacements, inflicted severe casualties on the attackers. Even with supporting naval gunfire and air strikes, American units at Omaha faced ferocious resistance. The scenes were chaotic and deadly as soldiers struggled to advance under relentless artillery and machine gun fire. Montgomery and Eisenhower's immediate goals were to establish a secure lodgement and seize strategic urban centers such as Cannes, which was vital for sustaining the offensive. German opposition near can prove tenacious and protracted, leading to prolonged combat before the city finally fell at a heavy cost. Although the Allies succeeded in establishing a firm beachhead and in building the logistics necessary to supply their forces, penetrating deeper into France remained a difficult and contested task. German counterattacks, while sometimes locally effective, ultimately failed to defeat the invasion. Factors contributing to these failures included disputes and poor coordination among German commanders, the Wehrmacht's depletion from prolonged fighting in the east, and critical shortages of material. These cumulative weaknesses allowed the Allies to consolidate their positions, reinforce their bridgehead, and gradually push forward into occupied France. The Allied forces, despite suffering heavy casualties in the initial hours, gradually began to make headway, leveraging their control of the air and sea to attrit German units and secure ground. As fighting pushed inland from Normandy, engagements proliferated across the French countryside. The combat remained bitter and costly, but the strategic balance started to tip in favor of the Allies. German formations were incrementally forced back, and Allied supply lines were gradually established, allowing steady reinforcement and resupply of men and material on the continent. The significance of the D-Day landings cannot be overstated. Although the subsequent battles across Normandy were protracted and brutal, the success of the amphibious assault marked a pivotal turning point in the Second World War. From that moment, the Allies advanced toward Germany, while the Nazi regime found itself increasingly encircled and on the defensive. Shortly after the initial landings on the western beaches, airborne operations continued on the Cotentin Peninsula behind Utah Beach as elements of the U.S. 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions descended by parachute and glider. Their mission was to seize and hold the exits and road junctions that would permit the amphibious forces landing later to move inland and threaten the vital port of Cherbourg. Pathfinders, specially trained teams intended to mark drop zones ahead of the main parachute lifts using Eureka radio beacons, were meant to guide the main airborne forces to precise landing points. Instead, dense cloud cover over the peninsula scattered many of the Pathfinder teams during their jumps, and numerous beacons failed to operate correctly on the ground. The result was widespread confusion. Many parachute units landed far from their intended zones. For instance, most of 2nd Battalion, 52nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, dropped on the wrong fields and spent much of D-Day attempting to regroup. Yet, in many cases, small groups that had landed off-target improvised command structures formed ad hoc composite units and still managed to press toward objectives. Although the airborne plan did not unfold as neatly as designed, the scattered drops created chaos behind German lines and helped secure the vital exits from Utah Beach. Concurrently, the preparatory aerial and naval bombardments against the German beach defenses began. The sheer volume of ordnance fired was immense, but its effectiveness varied. Many strongpoints remained intact and exacted a heavy toll on the assaulting troops. At Utah Beach, fortune favored the attackers. Many landing craft inadvertently put troops ashore well south of the planned sector, where defenses were light. Commanders there rapidly exploited the situation, and by mid-morning most organized resistance had been overcome with comparatively low casualties, around 197 men. A few miles east, Omaha Beach proved tragically different. Of all the invasion beaches, Omaha presented the sternest challenge. Much of its roughly 6-mile expanse was overlooked by cliffs some 45 meters high, which gave German firing positions commanding fields of fire over obstacles, mines, and barbed wire strewn across the sand. The only practicable routes off the beach were 5 ravines, narrow exits the attackers needed to take. The Germans, aware of their critical importance, had deliberately in-placed deadly defenses focused on these approaches. Central to the German defensive firepower was the MG-42 machine gun. The weapon's design made it exceptionally versatile, effective as a light machine gun for mobile use, yet also highly capable in fixed defensive roles where sustained, suppressive fire was required. On D-Day, the MG-42's belt-fed mechanism and rapid rate of fire created near-impregnable kill zones, while its quick-change barrel system made it less cumbersome than older water-cooled designs and allowed crews to maintain continuous fire more easily. These technical advantages, combined with solid German tactical positioning, contributed to the severe casualties among attacking Allied units. Accounts such as those of Heinrich Severloh, who later claimed in memoirs published in 2000 that he had inflicted between 1,000 and 2,000 casualties at Omaha, underscore the ferocity of the defense, though such personal estimates remain contested. Allied plans had called for heavy pre-landing shelling followed by precise bomber strikes to neutralize German strongpoints before the first assault waves reached the shore at 6:30. In practice, the bombardment failed to destroy many fortified positions, and bombers missed or insufficiently damaged key targets, leaving defenders able to inflict severe losses. Compounding the problem, the amphibious DD tanks meant to swim ashore and provide direct armor support suffered catastrophic losses at Omaha. When the 741st Tank Battalion launched most of its DD tanks some 5,000 meters offshore, 27 of 32 sank in the rough seas, depriving infantry of crucial fire support. Landing craft were swept off course by strong winds and currents. Some were swamped and their heavily laden occupants drowned, while others grounded on sandbars, forcing soldiers to wade ashore through neck-deep water and exposing them to prolonged enemy fire. The situation on Omaha grew so dire that General Omar Bradley, commander of U.S. ground forces, briefly considered aborting the landings there and redirecting the assault to Utah. Nevertheless, isolated small groups of troops managed to find weak points in the German defenses and link up. By nightfall, the chaotic situation began to stabilize. By the close of D-Day, approximately 34,000 men had landed at Omaha at a cost of more than 2,400 killed, wounded, or missing, the highest casualty toll of any of the 5 invasion beaches. An hour after the initial American, British, Canadian, and Free French assault waves struck the eastern sectors of Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, the British 50th Division encountered determined German resistance at Gold Beach. Despite this, the division progressed beyond the shoreline, although it did not achieve every planned objective. Canadian forces at Juno conducted some of the deepest penetrations into Normandy of any Allied formation that day, after fierce close quarters, fighting through villages and hedgerows. On Sword Beach, the initial assault broadly went according to plan. These eastern sectors benefited from an especially heavy naval bombardment, the largest of the 5, so that armor and infantry reached the sands in close succession, and tanks were generally available to provide immediate fire support. Specialized Allied armored vehicles, the so-called funnies, got to work clearing lanes through beach obstacles and minefields, filling ditches, and assaulting defensive positions with petard mortars and other equipment. Although many of these vehicles were themselves hit and destroyed, crews that survived dismounted and cleared obstructions manually. Within 2 hours of the initial assaults, 7 of the 8 designated beach exits had been breached. That success did not mean the fighting was easy. On Sword Beach, for example, a German strongpoint codenamed Cod took 3 hours to capture and inflicted heavy casualties on attacking battalions, with 2 units suffering around 25% casualties each. Yet by the end of D-Day, nearly 29,000 Allied troops had come ashore in these eastern sectors. With the notable exception of Omaha, the Allies generally overcame beach defenses during the first phase of the landings. German coastal units were widely under strength, thinly spread, and in many places unprepared for the scale and timing of the assault. A crucial strategic question remained: how would German armored forces react? Incredibly, much of the massive invasion armada that gathered off Normandy on June 5th went largely unnoticed by German intelligence, in part because poor weather in the preceding days had lulled defenders into a false sense of security. Rommel was away visiting family in Germany, and several senior commanders in the invasion sector were ironically engaged in anti-invasion training exercises when the real assault arrived. The first significant German counterattack on D-Day came that afternoon when the 21st Panzer Division, then the only local armored formation, pushed between British and Canadian positions toward the coast. The attack faltered under confused command decisions, disrupted communications, and overwhelming Allied firepower. The 21st Panzer reportedly lost more than half of its 124 tanks in the engagement. Other German armored reserves were held tightly under Hitler's centralized control and were released piecemeal. Hitler himself was difficult to rouse from sleep that morning, delaying decisions. Even when elements of Panzergruppe West were committed, it was already too late to blunt the Allied lodgement. The Allies' immediate post-landing challenge therefore became logistical. While the Mulberry artificial harbors were under construction offshore, supplies had to be unloaded directly onto the beaches using vehicles such as the DUKW amphibious truck, known as the Duck. These 6-wheeled amphibious transports proved invaluable for ferrying men, vehicles, and material from ship to shore until the more permanent harbor facilities were operational. The Allied advance from the beaches was hampered by difficult sea conditions and the rising tide, which reduced the exposed sand and forced men, vehicles, and equipment into tighter formations that limited movement and presented concentrated targets for German defenders. Allied air superiority severely restricted German daytime movement. Panzergruppe West, attempting to move toward Normandy, was repeatedly attacked by Allied fighter bombers and soon found itself unable to conduct large daytime maneuvers without suffering heavy losses. French resistance activity behind German lines disrupted reinforcements and supply movements, and although these partisan actions had some tactical success, they provoked brutal reprisals against the civilian population. The cumulative effect of these disruptions, the weather and Allied interdiction, contributed to delays and confusion in the German response. When the main German counterattacks did come, the 12th SS Panzer Division delivered one of the most determined efforts, attacking the Canadian 3rd Division on D+1, but the Allies were prepared. The Canadian 3rd Division had been reinforced with an unusually large quantity of artillery and gunners, giving it disproportionate indirect fire capability compared with its infantry strength. The Sexton's self-propelled gun, mounting a 25-pounder howitzer on a mobile chassis, was one such weapon that provided vital, mobile fire support for British and Canadian formations operating in Normandy. With close support from Allied warships offshore, Allied artillery and naval gunfire helped blunt and ultimately halt German counterattacks. By the time Panzer Lehr reached the sector to join an attack on D+2, German momentum had already been lost, and their formations were obliged to entrench defensively to stop Allied efforts to prize open can. On June 12th, the Allies captured Corentin, thereby linking all 5 invasion beaches into a continuous lodgement. With a constant stream of men, vehicles, and supplies flowing across the channel into the expanding beachhead, German hopes of driving the invaders back into the sea became unrealistic. The window for a decisive German counterstroke had closed. Nevertheless, the landings exposed acute logistical problems on D-Day. Unloading heavy equipment and supplies directly onto open beaches proved difficult because of rough seas, strong tidal flows, and inhospitable terrain. These conditions slowed movements off the sand and forced the Allies to accept an irregular, often precarious flow of material. The Mulberry artificial harbors were conceived and built to mitigate these bottlenecks, but even with them, logistics remained a major challenge in the early days of the campaign. The initial airborne operations, particularly those involving the 101st Airborne Division, suffered from poor weather and low visibility that disrupted Pathfinder teams and interfered with radio guidance equipment, scattering paratroopers far from their assigned drop zones and generating chaos on the ground. The struggle to secure key objectives such as can further illustrates the campaign's difficulties. Caen had been a primary Allied objective for D-Day. Yet stubborn German resistance and congested beach exits delayed the offensive, and the city remained under German control for several weeks before it was finally wrested from the defenders after costly fighting. The destruction of the DD amphibious tanks on D-Day was one of several technical and environmental failures. Only 5 DD tanks reached shore intact at some sectors. The remainder sank in rough seas, depriving infantry units of planned armor support. Failures in the pre-landing bombardment compounded the problem. Naval and aerial strikes did not consistently neutralize German defenses, allowing many bunkers and gun positions to remain operational and inflict severe casualties on assaulting troops. The German reaction to the invasion was slow and disorganized. Many German commanders did not immediately accept that a major landing had occurred, and several senior officers were absent from their commands when the assault began. Coordination problems, shortages of armored and air support, and Hitler's tight centralized control over reserve deployment meant that German counterattacks were piecemeal and ineffective in stopping the Allied lodgement. By contrast, French resistance sabotage and ambushes hampered German movement and delayed reinforcements, helping to secure Allied advantages on the ground even as civilians suffered reprisals. Allied commanders used the hard-won lodgement to methodically expand their foothold and organize the massive logistical effort required for sustained offensive operations. Engineers, salvage teams, and naval personnel worked around the clock to repair landing zones, clear obstacles, and accelerate the flow of men and material from ship to shore. Despite early chaos, the improvised solutions, pontoon causeways, dukus, and the mulberry harbors began to pay dividends, permitting steady reinforcement and resupply that turned fragile beachheads into a functioning base of operations. With supplies flowing, Allied planners shifted focus from merely holding ground to preparing for a deliberate breakout. To reduce German capacity to reinforce and counterattack, Allied air forces maintained relentless pressure on transport routes, railways, and convoys moving toward Normandy. Tactical interdiction sorties and strategic bombing disrupted German logistics, while air supremacy allowed close air support to be employed with devastating effect against counterattacking formations. Help sustain this channel by subscribing. Thank you for watching.